Okay, here we enter at part 4 on this, on sacred geometry and showing you more connections here. Randall was just talking about how the Sumerian kings list that's here all works off sacred geometry numbers that we all know, but then whenever you get to where you add it all up, they added up to that 432,000, that solar number that we've been looking at. Then he talked about how people used to live a long time, and if you believe if these people lived this long or this exact amount and not something like 64,822 and just rounded off numbers and things like that, comes out strange. But then also we have biblical numbers that are showing up with like Methuselah, everybody knows about, longest lived person or whatever, at 969 years old, and Lamech at 777. Now he said it looks like an order of magnitude, like we were talking about over in here on him, and so 96.9 would be Methuselah's age. But if one was to just look at the lunar solar idea that I was talking about before the end of the last one, you'd realize that you divide by 13, and therefore Methuselah would have lived about 78, 79 years old, and ended up being somewhere around able to see his own great grandkids. Because people bred much earlier back then and so on. Let's just continue.
Which, considering, from my perspective, the things I'd like to get done in this lifetime, I would need at least that many years.
Would anybody like to live forever? Well, if you really did live forever, I bet you'd feel pretty tired of it, like vampires quite often show and things like that. But I'm sure a lot of us would like to, instead of living maximum of 80, 90, maybe 100 years, of lasting 800, 900, 1,000 years. But we wouldn't want to be in the condition of what people look like over 100 years old all the way through that, because that wouldn't be any fun either. So we'd have to find some way to work that the other way. Of course, we've already got a population problem here on Earth, so to make it to where people last even longer is really not serving its purpose, is
it? In the Vayu Purana, which is again one of the Vedas, we find verses like this: 360 years, according to the human calculation, constitute one divine year. Wise people know that there are 4 yugas in Bharatavarsa. The first one is Kreta, then follow Treta, Dvapara, and Kali.
Now, 360 years is a Sumerian number. But then again, we keep saying that whenever it's actually a reality of a number connecting to our planet itself and lengths of time. So when you add it all up, it gets pretty interesting here. And believe me, we're not through in any way yet. We're only a third of the way into this.
Probably some of you have heard of the Kali Yuga that we're supposedly in right now, and supposed the age of darkness and the age of ignorance.
Yeah, the Kali Yuga. You know Kali Mar, like in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Kali, that great god, the one that they actually use the stones. Well, they also call this the age of ignorance or of darkness. And while it may have been the last time that somebody went through this for a lot of people, or comparative to now, I would say that we're well in our age of intelligence. But then again, with what's going on right now, with all the BS and everything, I would say, yeah, well, maybe you were more right about that ignorance situation, huh?
But you'll notice that they reckon time. They have another. The Vedas recognizes a sacred year that they call, or a divine year, which is 360 of our years. Okay, now here's a tabulation of the Vedic ages, and you'll notice. We'll look first at the total in human years, and we see that the Kali Yuga, the shortest, is 432,000. Then we go to 864,000, 1,296,000, 1,728,000, and 4,320,000. you'll notice that the total, or the Mahayuga, the Great Yuga, is 10 times the length of the Kali Yuga. And that's because you'll notice that the Dwapara is twice, the Treta is 3 times, and the Satya is 4 times. So taking the original term, doubling it, then tripling it, then quadrupling it, adding those together will give us 10 times the number we started with. But again,
and also, if you'll look at all of the number of durations in human years here, these numbers should show up on your piece of paper if you have it going here. 360, 720, 108, and 144, or 1,440. You'll also find these numbers here at the end to go with that. So it almost looks like the Sumerians built all up to this number, and then whenever the Aryans hooked up their calendar here, they worked off the same symbology, the same length of time, but they said that this would be the first one, and then a doubling, and so on and so on. And again, it finishes off at the Maya Yuga, which means maximum, or mega yuga, if you will. And it is, again, just a multiple of that 432 number. And when we compare it to the ancient Sumerians, we end up seeing that that 432 up top here is the sum of all the numbers that are right there. So here we're seeing this repeating over and over again. And like Randall says, I'm starting to see a pattern here.
Ends with. So it's almost as if we have 2 different traditions, but one system. And we see that the Sumerians preserved knowledge about the subdivisions of this Yuga time of 432,000 years, and symbolized these subdivisions by the reigns of these 10 pre-Diluvian kings. And then we can see that once we get to 432,000 years, at that point the Vedic cycles kick in, and then we have these that follow. And using the divine year of 360 years yields this column of numbers. And then when we put the duration in the human years, it's interesting, each of the yugas, such as the Kali Yuga, they were all believed to have a period of transition into the age, then the age itself, and then a period of transition out of the age.
And that's shown here as, again, an order of magnitude less of each one. You see it on each side, 36 on each side of the first one, 72 on the second, 108, 1440. So this gets a little longer. So maybe as you get smart, it takes a little bit longer to get to that next level, or in humanity, and so on. But also, we're looking at extreme amounts of time, aren't we, here? Extreme amounts of time. One would hope that before the end of this first one here, if we're looking at 400,000 years, we'd easily be Star Trek and all over the galaxy. Then there'd be a next step at 864, another, and so on, reaching to a culmination, which is 4,320,000 years down the road.
And so basically what they did was they took the total age. You'll notice here the relationship between the Kali Yugas, the 360,000, and the Sandhya, which was the transition in, and the Sangyamsa, which was the transition out, are each 1/10 of that, adding up to the total of 432. But you'll notice that we've got the same recurring numbers again. Now there's 144,000 right there. And then we have that raised by another order of magnitude. So you see how these same numbers are recurring over and over again. And I would suggest that there's a pattern emerging here. And I know that for a lot of people, first time they are confronted with this kind of information, sometimes it's almost too mind-boggling. What the heck does all these numbers mean?
I have the same effect whenever I try to explain it to somebody right in front of me. So I know whenever I do some of these videos, it gets to be too much information after a certain point. I can usually shove somebody full of information, 30, maybe 45 minutes, Some people a little longer if they're into it or already know some of these things, and so we can make a few steps forward. But usually if I'm showing them things that are just blowing their mind, there's only a certain number of fireworks that you can keep going on in your head. That's the reason why I got off of the sacred geometry thing and 3 different times now, is to give you time to digest it all. You need to go back through my videos though and look at each little section of it, and you'll see reoccurring numbers and everything, but when it becomes old hat to you, you'll realize that you've been initiated.
You know, it's just too many numbers to sort out. But what you realize once you start studying them is that each one of them is kind of a mnemonic, because each number has a whole collection of phenomena that's associated with it. And it's still in use today. I mean, how many people, I mean, everybody should know that, you know, a square foot is 144 square inches. I mean, anybody who's a builder, a craftsperson, an artist should know basic rules of measurement.
But also, it's as simple as saying there's 12 hours in a day and 12 hours in a night. There's 12 disciples. That sacred 12 is shown so many times. We built our whole calendar off of it with 12 months. And so all of this is a reoccurring theme that people have looked into before. And of course, back in the day, whenever they're like, oh, that's just Satan trying to fool you or something. And it's like, numbers don't lie, man. I mean, numbers and additions and things like this don't lie. It's showing you that these people knew of this, and they used it to designate time and space and cosmic cycles and the lengths of things from the shortest to the largest. It's freaking amazing. But if you think that it's only in India by the Aryans and the Aryan people of Sumer, you're mistaken a little bit. In fact, you can find it in many other places, but one of them that's important that you can find it in is on the other side of the world, showing you that there were connections that people are still not willing to even consider.
The Mayan world ages. Now you notice there, do we see similar numbers? The Baktun, 144,000 days. What? So it's almost like they took the same, they had the same numbers, 72. But they're now representing smaller cycles. But it's the same numbers representing the cyclical periods within nature.
Now they have this broken down somewhat here, but a tune is 360 days. So there they have that year idea, but then the 5 intercalated days and so on, and we start over again. But those numbers all are shown in our chart too, aren't they? In fact, if you break up the 20 days into what it adds up to, yeah, and even one day, in the amount of seconds there are in the whole day, and a half a day, and so on, showing you their connections with this, the time and space. It's amazing. Let's get into some more of this.
Moon is 360 days, and that was the sacred calendar that we find all over the ancient world. And then they had the 5 days added to that, the 5 unlucky days. So again, we see the same numbers being repeated redundantly throughout these various traditions.
And whenever I did that video showing Martin Sweatman talking to the people there in the conference here just recently, he showed that they had a solar lunar calendar built into that T-pillar that everybody knows about. T-pillar is at 53 or something, and so they were looking at that, and the up chevrons and down chevrons that are across the top header of that designate that there are 29 or 30 days, and then below that ended up showing you that there's 12 months of it. And then whenever you figure that out, that's a lunar calendar, but they're showing it in the solar form, and they show that, well, there's 11 days left over. Well, if you figure that out, that's 364 days, not 365. What's the deal? Well, if you'll look at the buzzard, as I always call them, that has a V-neck sweater on them. Those animals don't have that situation. That's something that shows up, and it shows up in Urfa Man, and quite a few other places. In fact, we looked at one of the Catalhoyuk sites, or not Catalhoyuk sites, the Tastapeller sites that are hooked up with Göbekli Tepe, and there's a symbology that looks like a idea of a master of the beast, and that master of the beast guy again has a V-neck shirt on. So they used to wear V-neck tees, ladies.
Sacred numbers embedded in solar system architecture. I'm only going to show you a few examples of this in order to convey to you the idea. The solar orb. Well, if we measure that, we discover its radius is 432,000 miles.
Now, how do these people figure this out? Well, there's people that have figured out how they figured it out. And how could they realize that the sun was so far away whenever the illusion to us is that it's the same size as the moon, and you can kind of tell the moon is close. So is the sun just a little bit farther right on the back side of it, scooching around behind it? No, they could tell that this thing was huge, but far, far off in the distance. Again, I'll tell you, the Sumerians used to say something that told you that our sun is like the stars, but as a torch far off in the distance. That's some understanding there. I mean, surely we understand it. You get told it as your kid, and then boom, 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 and you look up, twinkle, twinkle, little star, and you got it. But effectively, there were all kinds of people believing things like there was a firmament, like a fabric over it, like you've got a black tint on, and then you pop little holes in it, and depending on the size of the hole is how bigger or smaller these stars were, and so on. When it looks like these people here had figured out that some things are extremely far away, and of course that 432 becomes a sun number then too, and in fact that's the radius. If you go the full diameter, you'll figure out that's the doubled number that's there, and that also is a sacred geometry number.
Which of course means that its diameter is 864,000 miles. So notice that we measure the sun according to the human measure of miles. And by the way, what is the origin of the mile unit that we use? Anybody know? Origin of the mile?
Do you know the origin of the mile? I've talked about it in a few other videos. Maybe you didn't catch it, or you didn't catch that video. But mil, like in millipede, actually means 1,000. It doesn't mean a million. A million is 1,000 thousandths. Yeah, so we're referring to it on the scale like that there. But what's the origin of the mile? Well, whenever you go in the army and they tell you your left, your left, your left, right, left, and you're marching along, that left is only on the left foot, then you do a right and a left foot. Well, that is one pace, and by utilizing that, now different people, there'll be a 6'4" tall guy that'll have a bigger pace than somebody that's 5'6". But if we took the average, pegging up right close to 6 foot on these people, and then you average it all out, standard deviation, get a mean, it'll end up coming out to 5.28 feet in a normal stride. And whenever you times that times 1,000, or the mil, or the mile, you end up getting the measure of the mile that people have had for thousands of years. He'll give you a description on that, but it could go back much later than this. Let's look in.
Origin of the mile, it comes from the Latin word mil, which means 1,000. So it's talking about 1,000 something. What would it be talking about? 1,000 what? 1,000 paces that average 5.28 feet in length. It actually goes back, we know that Romans were using a mile that were 1,000 paces, and they would lay out, Rome, for example, had a city center, and everything was measured outwards from that city center according to paces, and those paces were 1,000 of them gave the Roman mile. The Roman pace was a little bit shorter than the British pace, which is where we get our mile from. Our mile, in fact, interestingly, and I'm going to show you a diagram of this shortly, Stonehenge is 105, outer ring of the Sarsonstone circle measures right at about 105.6 feet, which makes it 1/5 of a mile, or 1/50th of a mile, I'm sorry.
So there's another connection. He talks about in other places where there's a furlong that people have used forever and ever, and it's what the circus was, and the big chariot races where they went around a post at this end and then straightened out, went around a post at this end, kind of like a NASCAR of its day, you know, Ben-Hur and all of that stuff, right? Well, lo and behold, a furlong is 660 feet going around that, but a furlong is based on the measurement of the earth, and so once around that track is a mockery in a small section of once around the world. We'll get into that here coming up shortly. Here you can see the sun cutting between certain zones on a certain day every year in Stonehenge. And people have said, well, yeah, there's a connection of here and here, but that's about it, really. Then somebody found out, no, the moon cuts through this too at all these different places, and that has to do with this whole cycle of the moon that they had figured out a long time ago. These old wizard hats that I used to show you, wish I could throw in a picture of it right now, but a big tall wizard hat like Gandalf that made out of gold and little circles all around it. What's that? That's that metonic cycle. But they knew about that before Meton and the thing that we're even talking about with the hat and whenever it was even supposedly built. Now the fact that Stonehenge is based on a measurement that breaks down into all of these sacred geometry things, they're using that same connection, and so miles have been used for many thousands of years, not just back to Roman times that we think of. And we can see that here, but there are other places too that we can find it at. And it gets pretty deep on this thing that they do. And you know how they talked about how the cubits weren't all the same, and that was supposed to throw you off on the idea that, oh yeah, they're not the same cubit. They call it a cubit. I call it a yard, mine's different than yours and so on and everything. No, that's actually based on something too. And here we go with astronomy again. But let's get into this.
That and several other numbers that we find in megalithic structures in ancient England suggest that the mile was actually a unit of measure that was being used as long ago as 4,000 years or longer. And we're still using it today, the same unit of measure that could have been used 4,000 years ago. And for that reason, and once you begin to get into and understand the sacred basis of our ancient metrological or measuring systems, you'll realize that if we convert completely over to the metric system, we're going to lose something very, very profound.
And moments like this remind me of that scene in Lord of the Rings, whenever Galadriel, who is ever so wise, through telepathy ends up telling him that there are things that have been forgotten, things that were lost that shouldn't have been. And this is one of them. And aren't you glad that back whenever I was a kid, for the second time I think, or the third, they tried to push a metric system on us, and it didn't really work. It's amazing they've gotten England to do so whenever they were one of the founders of the people who always embraced it and ended up changing over. And I know it works off the speed of light and everything too. There can be two separate measurements though done for things. It doesn't have to be unified in that way. Everything doesn't have to be the same. All stores don't have to be Taco Bell.
All right, remember what was the length of the Kali Yuga? 432,000 years. What was the length of the Dwapara Yuga? 864,000 years. What was the length of a Platonic month? 1/12 of the great year. Anybody remember? 2,160 years, right? The same number of degrees that measure the cube.
You're catching all these connections that go on, right? Well, worse than that, and I don't think he even says it in this whole program off of here. You know music. Well, you know what A is?